Phaedo. They say that man finds himself in a prison. They say that man is a servant to the gods. Some say that man does himself a disservice to escape from this prison, thereby escaping the umbrella of wisdom, of guidance, and of direction by the gods. Now he escapes this prison through death. Now this is one way of seeing it. But we can also leave this prison towards the gods, a union with the gods and wise men after death. That's another view of dying. It is a view of hope for the future of man. This is something that Socrates indicates occurs through life of practice, of philosophy. It is a practice that prepares one for death. And death, he says, is the separation of the body and the soul. The soul being the chief concern of the philosopher. Moreover than that, the concern of the philosopher is this continual separation of the body and the soul. And the analogy is made, if death is the separation of the body and the soul, then what the philosophers are doing is preparing themselves for death. That is, as we move closer to the gods, we separate ourselves from the bodily existence. I think it may be unfortunate here, but we see the bodily existence referred to as the things of pleasure. I'm not sure how I feel about that at this point. That is to say, to relegate the existence of the body to that of the pleasures. But the point we follow remains that in this view of hope upon death, the philosopher has practiced his entire life and does not feel despair at the time of his dying, for he has practiced the separation of this body and soul, and he knows what it is to mean for himself. He is at peace with this process. Now, to continue this line of thought with this idea of the separation of the body from the soul, Plato, through Socrates, indicates that the body is this untrustworthy source of information, that we cannot necessarily trust our senses, our vision, our hearing, etc. It can give us false information about the environment. Now, that's not to say that it is completely ineffective at doing so. But at the very least, Plato raises this point, that there can be inconsistencies, false inputs from the body. And so the question is, how can the soul grasp the truth when deceived by the body? And in Plato's reasoning, the soul, through human reasoning, leads to clarity because it is free from external insults, external influences. And so through this reasoning, through the soul, we are able to come to the objects of our mind, let's say, the objects of our reality that we cannot perceive through our senses. Things like the just, the good, and the beautiful. Because we do not deny that these exist, but nowhere can we point to and say, here is the just, here's the good, and here's the beautiful. Now that statement is not entirely correct. For if one is to believe in truth, one must believe in some standard. One must believe in some manifestation in the real world of these things. Now, of course, in the state of nature, the mind of man is the thing that gives light to these objects to fill the categories that we just described. Now, just because this is unique to the mind of man does not mean that it is purely man-made. We might say in our age that this is purely subjective. But again, if man is to believe in the truth, it cannot just be that. It has to be much more than that. There has to be a true relationship to reality for it to be true. And to comment further on the body, and to drive home the point that the body, from Plato's standpoint, is not trustworthy, but more so than just not trustworthy. He indicates that it is the life's work of the philosopher to separate the soul from the body. The body is a sort of evil thing. It is the thing that produces our fears. It is how we receive disease. It is the source of our wants and our desires. It is something that must be nurtured. It prevents us from seeing the truth. Now, the issue that I have with this is that Plato seems to demonize the passions regardless of their direction. For what is the soul without the body? What is the body not the vessel that contains the soul? It is not the abandonment of the body that makes man wise, but it's in the temperance of the heart's desires. And the efficient way that this is done, I think, that makes man wise. What is the pursuit of philosophy if not to orient the body to desire the true things, the elevated things of the soul, such as the good, the true, and the beautiful? Now, I've approached this dialogue with a bit of a different way than I have with previous podcasts. This is the first time that I'm taking written notes. And also, I'm taking a little bit longer pauses between recordings so that I can reflect on the notes and relay them back. It's not as ad-lib as the Psalms were. Now, having said that, I'll try my best to maintain some level of coherence here. I'm going to continue to follow the dialogue as it flows, and my notes will stay in a linear pattern. But I think what we will find here is that often through these recordings it may seem like a sudden jump between pauses, but try to stay with the main topic of discussion. And so I mention that because this is one such pause. I returned to this after a few days of not recording. So, to recap, we were talking about the way to approach the gods. The initial approach, we had sort of a cynical view that upon death we are men that are liberated from a cage, the cage of life. Life is a bit of a prison. The other view of death is that we are moved towards the divine. We are moved towards unity with God, or in the ancient Greek context, with the gods. And in this way we have hope for the future. We have hope for being saved, in a certain sense, liberated from our prison towards a higher state of being. And what follows from that, if one believes this sort of thing, is that man's life is committed to living as though his soul is to be separated from his body upon death. And so the life's work of a philosopher is to prepare for death in some sense. And of course, as we've discussed, this gets into the dilemma of the body and the possible false perception that we receive from it, or the false senses that we receive from it, and the resultant false perception that we conclude. But to move this conversation a bit farther, on the matter of pleasure, on the matter of licentiousness, this is something that can be seen as a bit of a prison as well, where the pleasures are our master and we are the slaves to it. It leads to licentious behavior. But from Plato's reasoning, pleasure only provides us with a false sense of elevation. If we imagine a pyramidal structure, where at the top we have virtue, and along this pyramid we have the reality of man. We have all of its inconsistencies and its ups and its downs, its back and forths. At the top always remains virtue. Now, this pyramid that I describe is not one to be described for the reality that is, but rather our individual reality, our reality that is fraught with the things that we have just described about the false perceptions of the actual reality. And so we order our perception on an individual basis according to our understanding of what is, to the actual reality. Now, the argument here by Plato, again, is that pleasure will only lead to a false sense of elevation. So we can have a pleasure, and we can place it beneath what is always on top, which is the virtue. And we can delude ourselves into thinking that our pleasure, or what our aims are after, is sort of our virtue, what makes us virtuous. Perhaps that is not entirely clear. Let's say we choose to pursue wealth. We pursue it because of the pleasure that we receive, the material gains that come from wealth, the sense of security that we get from having money. Not necessarily bad in and of itself, but in terms of an individual and an individual's hierarchy of value, it is quite possible that the way in which this is organized for a man may not accurately line up or match up to the reality that is. And man may find himself in the prison of his pleasures, in the prison of licentiousness, and delude himself into a life of false virtue. Now wisdom, if pleasure, now I hesitate to say this, there are two ways to say this. I think one is to make pleasure inseparable from wisdom. Another way to say that would be to chain the heart to the soul. The heart being the seat of all desires and feelings. The thing that can drive our action. We can elevate a certain feeling, and yet this feeling can delude us. Again, it can lead us into a false sense of virtue once we have conquered that feeling, once we have found an attractive woman to have sex with. We feel that we have achieved and accomplished an end, satisfied a desire of the heart. And not all desires of the heart are as superficial as that. Certainly there are ones that are quite lofty, that I think when pursued under the guise of good intentions can often have dramatic negative consequences. But if we are to apply wisdom and make it inseparable from pleasure, that is the satisfaction of the heart, satisfaction of our desires, then what do we have? Well, we have a body. We have wisdom together within the body of pleasure. Now, wisdom is the cleansing and purification of the body. So, once pleasure is coupled to this wisdom, the pleasure is cleansed and purified. It is properly oriented, in other words. Because as long as we live this life and we are attached to this physical reality, we will always have the pleasures of the body. But through moderation, through courage, through justice, through this process of cleansing and purification, we can come to a good life. We can be pious individuals. Now, it is Plato's argument that the man that's initiated is the one that moves into the underworld and dwells with the gods. The man that is uninitiated wallows in the mire. But what exactly does it mean to be initiated? Well, I think it has to do with this process of becoming, this process of being. But this is something that we get into. Siebes makes the argument that the upon the separation of the body and the soul at death, the result of that equation is absolute nothingness. That the soul cannot survive without the body. Now, in response, Socrates proposes his hypothesis of opposites. He starts by indicating the world as a centralizing figure. And as the soul leaves the world into the underworld, there is a continued existence. And from the underworld, we have the souls that move into the world and is sort of reborn. For the living go to die, and the dead return to the living. He gives a number of examples. The larger moves to the smaller, as the smaller can move to the larger. We can say that one finger is larger than another because it comes from the smaller. We understand the relationship between the two because of this hypothesis of opposites. That is, the larger comes from the smaller and the smaller from the larger. We have understanding of the just because it is relative to its opposite, to the unjust. And that the just can become unjust, and the unjust can become just. Just as the hot can become cold, and the cold can become hot. And what makes us understand what is hot and what is cold? What makes us understand what is just and unjust? What is the thing that makes us understand what is larger and what is smaller? What is living and what is dead? Those that have an opposite come from its opposite. But the primary thing to keep in mind is not necessarily the opposite, the thing and its opposite. It's the process of becoming. It's the flowing from the one to the other. Because this is what gives us our perspective. It liberates us from this continual relativism. The process of becoming is dynamic. We understand that we are in a sort of mode of existence that is dynamic. It is a process of becoming, a continual recognition of opposites, of moving into one, of falling into another. This cyclical pattern, the sleep-wake cycle, is another example of this. This is something that we experience every day. So the question is, what comes to be from being? Now this conversation is centered around the dead and the living, because we're talking about the soul. We want to know what happens to the soul after death. We know what happens to the body. Now what we recognize is a process, again, a process of becoming. This dynamic system that feeds from the world of the living to the world of the dead and returning to the world of the living. Now, if this process of becoming is not balanced or does not occur in the way that it should in this sort of cyclical motion, then we cease to become. Things are completely linear, at the end of which is nothing but death. We are absorbed in death. If this is false, and the living come from the dead, how do the souls exist? In what way do they exist? Now this prompts a discussion about learning. That learning equals recollection. Recollection being equivalent to man and his dynamic existence. Something that comes from the equal, but necessarily inferior to. That there is some source of knowledge out there that is embedded with the soul of man. Now, what exactly is the soul? It is not some mythical, unobservable thing within us that escapes natural law. Of course, our existence is bound by these laws of nature. Again, we are physical beings. And so the soul is a word that is used to describe the being of man and his dynamic process of becoming. Now we get into a discussion of relativism. That we can say that of recollection and of memory, we can recall things from experiences in our external environment that are familiar to us, that are similar to things that we have experienced in the past or observed in the past. And we can also recall this memory from things that are dissimilar to the memory. There's something about this object, although dissimilar to perhaps the object of the memory, stimulates the recurrence of this memory, the recollection. And in a sense, we see a relationship between what is totally equal, this capital E equal, and everything that finds itself to be inferior to it. There can be sticks that appear equal to other sticks, stones that appear equal to other stones. The perception of man can lead to his recollection, perhaps of the stones or of the sticks. Now this recollection may be dissimilar to the object that he experiences or similar, but again, it flows back onto what is the capital E equal. The through line, or the thing that unites the objects that are observed. The sort of binding force. And so what exactly does this mean? And how can we pull all of this stuff together? All the stuff about the talk of the separation of the soul from the body after death, about the duty of the philosopher to separate his soul from his body during life in his pursuit of philosophical practice to prepare for death, his distrust of the body and its senses because of the potential for false information to flood his perception, the reasoning of the soul to find the elevated things of sort of the divine nature of what is considered to be the just, the good, and the beautiful. the liberation from licentiousness and the proper ordering of wisdom and pleasure to find virtue in life. To understand moderation, true moderation, honest moderation, courage, and justice. To find ourselves initiated upon death, to dwell with the gods. Of course, this brings up many, many questions about existence. Existence after death. In what way, in what form, but we are not there yet. Our conversation of opposites. That we know of one because of the other. And that if we had not known of one, then it would be a purely linear relationship, leading in one direction to infinity or to death. It is our process of becoming, of flowing into and flowing from, that allows two opposites to exist together. They exist together because they know of each other. They recall one another. There's a precondition in the mind of man, I think this is what Plato says, understands this, from birth up until old age. Now we can make good arguments about the process of development of the mind, because certainly the mind, this is more of a Christian perspective, but the mind is a machine that develops. It's a machine that is capable of perceiving. It's about how we direct this machine. This sort of goes back to the Platonic discussion of the pairing of wisdom and pleasure. That is to cleanse and purify the pleasures through wisdom. And in this way become virtuous. No doubt the secular man will continue to struggle with the conversation that we've had of the dead and the living. For our conception is that, in the natural sense, that the dead do not have any impact on the living. That there is no relationship. That our existence is entirely linear. That we are an accident. That we come from nothing. And our existence is speeding forward until absolute death. That the life of man is in this continual state of sleep, or state of life, perhaps, but there is no connection or union between the two. But of course this doesn't make any sense to us. We understand, just as we do every day, we fall to sleep and we wake up the next morning. Now what of death? Well, this is exactly the conversation of recollection. It is of the sticks and of the stones. It is of the dissimilar and of the similar. Now what is dissimilar of man falling asleep and waking up, and living his life and dying? Well, in the first, he continues to exist in a particular way. And in the second, his existence in that same particular way ends. But also, if we zoom out, if we think of the capital E equal, that is a little bit less satisfying to the self and to the ego of man, but nonetheless it is possible to zoom out and to see that life and death, the capital L and the capital D, removed from the selfish portion of man, the individual, this process of sleep and awakening in terms of life and death continues. There is a similarity between the two. Now both this dissimilarity and similarity have the through line. I think it is easier to see through the similarity because it is closer to the capital E, whereas the dissimilarity is farther from the capital E equal. But nonetheless, I think this process is a thing for man to perceive and to appreciate. And to close these arguments before I continue on, I'll say that the similarity between life and death and wake and sleep, or sleep and wake, that cycle, is not all that different. Now there are major differences between the two examples. Again, in a certain sense, in the sense of the individual, but remove the dissimilar, the limiting dissimilar, but keep the aspect of the dissimilar and the similar, and we find that they mirror quite well. For without the ego of man, without his individual constraints, we find that life moves into death, and from death moves into life, just as man falls asleep and wakes up. Now the learning being equivalent to recollection comes from this point. It comes from the ability of man to recognize the similar within the dissimilar, this relationship of opposites. And the hierarchy that is created provides us with a glimpse into the nature of our reality as it is organized. That this capital E equal is one of many conceptions, divine conceptions. What is just, what is beautiful and good are other conceptions here. Now ultimately I think these feed into some unity of being. The being that sprang being itself into existence. That gave being to non-being. So we were about to transition into, in one sense it is a continuation of the conversation, but in another sense it can be kind of difficult to follow. I myself have been having difficulty keeping track with the arguments proposed thus far, but they are sort of sequential, which is a good thing. Now, where we are right now is a place of understanding. I think there are some things here, some implied things that have not been spoken of. We're dealing heavily within the realm of unity. We talk of capital E equal We talk of the good, we talk of the beautiful, we talk of just. All of these things are elevated conceptions that have the quality of unity to them. That is to say, they are higher forms of categorization that bind many things together. Now, in a sense, I think the things that bind are what we are concerned with here. We had this discussion of the opposites. And the emphasis on this discussion of the opposites was the process of becoming, the one flowing into the other, the understanding of one because of the existence of the other. Now, the difficulty I am having is following and seeing this transjective, this binding force through all levels of our experience and all levels of our reality. And it comes to the point where Socrates and company are talking of, how would we say, knowledge before birth. We were talking of the existence of the soul before birth. And we are also adding the quality of intelligence. Socrates says, "So then, Simmias, our soul also existed apart from the body before they took on human form, and they had intelligence." To me, this seems like a leap. But I think as we continue, perhaps we can find the link between these things, because we have to remember that we are dealing heavily with unity. So our question then becomes, at what point does the soul of man perhaps that's not the right question. I can ask, when is the soul of man produced? Is there an ending to his soul? Is the soul immortal? And I'm not quite sure if I have said this before, but if we are to view the human soul as a mirror to the infinite being equivalent to the source of being, the divine unity, the capital G God, then I think we can think of a few consequences that come from this. Now, either man, having the capacity to reflect this divine image, is temporary as long as the mirror exists, or there is some through line that I have yet to see and yet to think of, that prior to his physical existence, there exists some element of his being, of his soul, in this case before, and in the next case that they will get into, after death. So these questions are our concern at the moment. And now I'd like to add that given my modern mind, the critical mind, perhaps unfortunate to a degree, but also important to test the truth, when I hear the response by Simmias saying, "Unless we acquire the knowledge at the moment of birth, Socrates, for that time is still left to us," I think that this question can use a slight modification. Because we know at birth, and we know that throughout life, there are changes to our physical form. There are changes to the mind. And if the mind is to be an integral part of the soul, that is the seat of being, this thing that has the mirror to reflect the infinite, then it is possible that the knowledge may not come to us at the moment of birth, but rather at some point in life. Now, it doesn't really supplant the idea of the recollection of the unification that comes from both the similar and the dissimilar, but rather the thing in this reality that can know of the unification, I think, depends on its material makeup. Because there is a difference between man and a rock or a stick. I don't think that they would make the argument that the stick or the rock would have knowledge of anything, or that they have a soul prior to their existence, prior to their birth. So my conception here that I'm proposing is that we can still operate within this Platonic framework that we are given. Again, this retrieving the knowledge that is out there in the universe. Something that we seem to know because we are a part of this divine unity. We are born of it. But we may have to modify and say that it is conditional. Now, the conditions are usually right for man when he finds himself in a position to have a family and to continue the cycle of life. But the mechanism by which the big E equal, the good, the beautiful, and the just are reflected by our souls, again, the mirror of being, the mirror to the divine being, which again, inherently, I think, encapsulates the idea of this recollection of some prior knowledge. Because if one is not immediately aware of one's appearance, they can just walk into the bathroom and look into the mirror. Now, it is not in a sense that they were unaware of what they looked like. They were unaware of the details, perhaps. Perhaps I should say this differently. If you walk into the bathroom and look into the mirror, what you see is a different image of the self. It's not as though you had no knowledge of the self prior to looking into that mirror, because you were that self. It was you in terms of being. It's not until you saw it in the mirror that you saw it differently. Now, perhaps this is what Plato is getting at. There's this separation between ways of seeing and existing in oneself and being. I think we've hit upon it here. And so this knowledge, before and after, is different. The knowledge that one has when they look into the mirror, perhaps for the first time, to see oneself, it doesn't necessarily transform oneself, but it gives additional information about the appearances of the self. It brings into conscious conception their being. And so I think that this is, in part, the transjective. It is moving being into a form that is aware of its own being. Now, what can we say of this prior knowledge? Does it only exist when man is alive, or can it exist before and can it exist after? So here we will continue with this conversation. Quite so, my friend. But at what other time do we lose it? We just now agreed that we are not born with that knowledge. Do we then lose it at the very time we acquire it? Or can you mention any other time? And the reply to Socrates is, I cannot, Socrates. I did not realize that I was talking nonsense. So this is our position, Simmias, he said. If those realities we are always talking about exist, the beautiful and the good, and all that kind of reality, and we refer all the things we perceive to that reality, discovering that it existed before and is ours, and we compare these things with it, then, just as they exist, so our soul must exist before we are born. If these realities do not exist, then this argument is altogether futile. Is this the position that there is an equal necessity for those realities to exist, and our souls to exist before we are born? If the former do not exist, neither do the latter. The response: I do not think, Socrates, said Simmias, that there is any possible doubt that it is equally necessary for both to exist. And it is opportune that our argument comes to the conclusion that our soul exists before we are born. And equally so, that reality of which you are now speaking. Nothing is so evident to me personally as that all such things must certainly exist, the beautiful, the good, and all those you mentioned just now. I also think that sufficient proof of this has been given. So what I'd like to examine is Socrates' statement. He makes the case for the realities of the good, capital G, and the beautiful, capital B. That these are standards, that these are the sources by which we compare things to. And this, if we remember, is this conception of man's knowledge, of his potential for knowledge. Because Socrates says that, again, these are the items, these are the centralizing principles by which we compare many things to. Now, to us in the modern day, they seem subjective. We have yet to find a method or a pursuit that brings us totally to the truth. Now, our traditional systems are designed to get us to as close as we can to the truth, to the good and the beautiful, through different methods, through courage, through moderation, by chaining wisdom to pleasure, thereby directing the heart to nullify certain desires and to amplify them when they are appropriately appointed. So if this reality is to exist, this reality of the ultimate standard, if this is to exist, and this is something that exists before the individual reality, before he is aware of his existence, he makes the claim that our soul must exist before we are born. Now, why would that be? Well, it would be because the soul exists in a similar state as that of the good and that of the beautiful, the capital G. It is something that I have already laid out explicitly in this podcast, on this podcast. That is to say, the sort of mirror argument, that the soul of man is from the source of being. And when it finds itself to exist in this world, it is nothing but a mirror. Now, this existence is fraught with evils, I guess you could say, misplaced goods, misdirection of the heart. And I think this is where man gets into trouble. Now, I do like the honesty here. And Socrates says, well, if these realities don't exist, then this argument doesn't make any sense. It's futile. Is this the position, that there is an equal necessity for those realities to exist, and for our souls to exist before we are born? If the former do not exist, neither do the latter. And Simmias seems to respond quite well to this. This is what he feels in his bones to be right. And Socrates says, then what about Cebes? For we must persuade Cebes also. In response, he is sufficiently convinced, I think, said Simmias, though he is the most difficult of men to persuade by argument. But I believe him to be fully convinced that our soul existed before we were born. I do not think myself, however, that it has been proved that the soul continues to exist after death. The opinion of the majority, which Cebes mentioned, still stands, that when a man dies, his soul is dispersed, and this is the end of its existence. What is to prevent the soul coming to be and being constituted from some other source, existing before it enters a human body, and then, having done so, is departed from it, itself dying and being destroyed? You are right, Simmias, said Cebes. Half of what needed proof has been proved, namely that our soul existed before we were born. But further proof is needed, that it exists no less after we have died, if the proof is to be complete. It has been proved, even now, Simmias and Cebes, said Socrates, if you are ready to combine this argument with the one we agreed on before, that every living thing must come from the dead. If the soul exists before, it must, as it comes to life and birth, come from nowhere else than death, and being dead. So how could it avoid existing after death, since it must be born again? What you speak of has then even now been proved. However, I think you and Simmias would like to discuss the argument more fully. You seem to have this childish fear that the wind would really dissolve and scatter the soul as it leaves the body, especially if one happens to die in a high wind and not in calmer weather. So I think what we are seeing here is an argument for the immortality of the soul, and that this life and death scenario applies specifically to man's natural existence. But the soul is something altogether different. Now, in my conception, I would not say that this soul retains the individual character of the human being as it leaves him. I think it sort of returns to the source, and perhaps to say return, I think, might be false as well. The way man continues, the way the unique thing about the human being continues, that is all of the individual traits and characteristics, it continues in a certain way, in a certain spirit. It retains its being by its continual existence. But its character, I think, can change throughout the ages, and I think that our religious institutions and our traditions are an attempt to orient that being towards the divine good. And so while we, in this life, can experience it most fully, because as we move into death, we will no longer have the self. Now the self is just like the heart, I think. It's full of potential pitfalls. It is full of false sense perception. It is quite quick to delude itself, or to overinflate itself, and to hold on to things about the life that it finds itself in. To become too material, and in the process of doing so, it becomes a tortured existence for the individual, because the soul is sort of overshadowed by the ego. And so in this way, I understand what Plato is saying about the separation of the soul and the body, and of this being the philosopher's duty in life, in a sense to prepare for death, and for his being to be liberated by the constraints of the heart and the constraints of the self. Now, I think there is no secret at this point in our human story that there are quite severe consequences when one alters the relationship within the self, I could say, within the individual. So not necessarily the self, but within the individual. When one starts to tinker and turn the knobs within the individual, in terms of what to constrain and what to liberate, the consequences of which are very, very profound. And I have this difficulty determining what knobs I should turn in my own life. But I also have this understanding through seeing that we, as a society, seem to be turning the wrong ones. The dial is a few degrees off of where it should be, and it's leading to some conflict. But I think this conflict allows us to see the opposite. As we flow into the perhaps more unstable period, we will appreciate better what stability is. Let's continue. So the statement, you seem to have this childish fear that the wind would really dissolve and scatter the soul as it leaves the body, especially if one happens to die in a high wind and not in calmer weather. I think this points to this fear. I think it comes from the individual. It comes from the self. It comes from the part of the self that wants this material existence, that's afraid of what it means to lose that part of itself. Now Cebes laughs and he says, assuming that we were afraid, Socrates, try to change our minds, or rather do not assume that we are afraid, but perhaps there is a child in us who has these fears. Try to persuade him not to fear death like a boogie. You should, said Socrates, sing a charm over him every day until you charmed away his fears. Where shall we find a good charmer for these fears, Socrates, he said, now that you are leaving us. Greece is a large country, Thebes, he said, and there are good men in it. The tribes of foreigners are also numerous. You should search for such a charmer among them all, sparing neither trouble nor expense, for there is nothing on which you could spend your money to greater advantage. You must also search among yourselves, for you might not easily find people who could do this better than yourselves. That shall be done, said Thebes, but let us, if it pleases you, go back to the argument where we left off. Of course it pleases me. Splendid, he said. We must then ask ourselves something like this. What kind of thing is likely to be scattered? On behalf of what kind of thing should one fear this? And for what kind of thing should one not fear it? We should then examine to which class the soul belongs, and as a result either fear for the soul or be of good cheer. Now this is exactly the direction that I want this conversation to go into. This is exactly what we were talking about before. What you say is true. Is not anything that is composite and a compound by nature liable to be split up into its component parts, and only that which is non-composite, if anything, is not likely to be split up? I think that is the case, said Thebes. Are not the things that always remain the same and in the same state most likely not to be composite, whereas those that vary from one time to another and are never the same are composite? I think that is so. Let us then return to those same things which we were dealing earlier, to that reality of whose existence we were giving an account in our questions and answers. Are they ever the same and in the same state, or do they vary from one time to another? Can the equal itself and the beautiful itself, each thing in itself, the real, ever be affected by any change whatever, or does each of them, that really is, being uniform by itself, remain the same and never in any way tolerate any change whatsoever? They must remain the same, said Thebes, and in the same state, Socrates. What of the many beautiful particulars, be they men, horses, clothes, or other things, are the many equal particulars, and all those which bear the same name as those others? Do they remain the same in total contrast to the other realities? One might say, never in any way remain the same as themselves or in relation to each other. So to recap, so we don't lose our way here, what is this saying? So we have two objects of our attention. We have that which is composite, which can be broken down into its constituent parts. And of this composite, we can say that this is something that can change. We can say that it is subject to change. The other object of our attention is non-composite. Something that is non-composite is something that stays the same. It cannot be reduced. It is at its most fundamental composition. It stays whole. And so the examples of the non-composite, or the things that stay whole, that are not subject to change, are the capital G, good, the capital B, beautiful, the capital J, justice, the capital E, equal. And of the examples for the composite, or the things that can change, would be man, it would be horse, right, the animal, small b, beautiful, clothes, material things. Now from this, what can we say? Specifically, what can we say of man and of the example of the small b beautiful? How does this differ, and why does it differ from the capital B? Why does man differ from capital B being? Why does the being of man differ from the capital B being? Socrates continues, the latter in this case, that is the composite, that which is subject to change. The latter you could touch and see and perceive with the other senses, but those that always remain the same can be grasped only by the reasoning power of the mind. They are not seen, but are invisible. That is altogether true, he said. Do you then want us to assume two kinds of existences, the visible and the invisible? Let us assume this. And the invisible always remains the same, whereas the visible never does? Let us assume that too. Now one part of ourselves is the body, another part is the soul. Quite so. To which class of existence do we say the body is more alike and akin? To the visible, as anyone can see. And what about the soul? Is it visible or invisible? It is not visible to men, Socrates, he said. Well, we meant visible and invisible to human eyes, or to any others, do you think? To human eyes. Then what do we say about the soul? Is it visible or not visible? Not visible. So is it invisible? Yes. So the soul is more like the invisible than the body, and the body more like the visible. Without any doubt, Socrates. Haven't we also said some time ago that when the soul makes use of the body to investigate something, be it through hearing or seeing or some other sense, for to investigate something through the body is to do it through the senses. It is dragged by the body to the things that are never the same. And the soul itself strays and is confused and dizzy, as if it were drunk, in so far as it is in contact with that kind of thing. And Sieb says, certainly. So we have here a few new conceptions. We have explained what the composite and non-composite is, the composite being something subject to change, and now we have the reasoning that it is also the visible. It is something that can be seen by the human eye. The non-composite is not subject to change, and it is invisible. Now the examples of these further examples, the soul would be the example of something that is non-composite. It is invisible, it is not subject to change. The composite is the body. It is subject to change. It is subject to the forces of nature. So the question is, what happens when the soul and the body interact? Socrates says it's sort of dragged along by the body. The soul must be bound to it in a way. It investigates something through the body, that is, through its senses, through its vision, through its hearing, through its smelling, through its taste, through its touch perception. And so we see the forever changing composite structure of the body bringing the non-composite, the non-changing, the non-visible along with it. and constantly sort of being at odds, opposing its nature. Socrates says it is dragged by the body to the things that are never the same. And the soul itself strays and is confused and dizzy, as if it were drunk, and insofar as it is in contact with that kind of thing. And so why would it be that the soul strays and is confused and dizzy as if it were drunk? I think it has to do with this opposing nature. Because there's an understanding, there's a prior knowledge, this is what they were getting into, that the soul is beyond the body, and parts of the body would include the temporary elements of mind. The temporary elements of mind would be individualism, it would be subjectivism, it would be the ego, it would be the heart, everything that tethers it to this sort of temporary, natural existence. And the soul sees this with its understanding and is a bit confused by the way the body thinks. And this is what causes this confusion. Its understanding of reality seems to be insufficient to support the soul's non-composite, non-visible nature. It is putting something in this material vessel. But Socrates says, but when the soul investigates by itself, it passes into the realm of what is pure, ever-existing, immortal, and unchanging. And being akin to this, it always stays with it whenever it is by itself and can do so. It ceases to stray and remains in the same state, as it is in touch with things of the same kind. And its experience, then, is what is called wisdom. Altogether well said and very true, Socrates, he said. Judging from what we have said before, and what we are saying now, to which of these two kinds do you think that the soul is more alike and more akin? I think, Socrates, he said, that on this line of argument, any man, even the dullest, would agree that the soul is altogether more like that which always exists in the same state, rather than like that which does not. What of the body? That is like the other. Look at it also this way. When the soul and the body are together, nature orders the one to be subject and to be ruled, and the other to rule and be master. Then again, which do you think is like the divine, and which do you think like the mortal? Do you not think that the nature of the divine is to rule and to lead, whereas it is that of the mortal to be ruled and be subject? I do. Which does the soul resemble? Obviously, Socrates, the soul resembles the divine, and the body resembles the mortal. Consider then, Cebes, whether it follows from all that has been said that the soul is most like the divine, deathless, intelligible, uniform, indissoluble, always the same as itself, whereas the body is most like that which is human, mortal, multiform, unintelligible, soluble, and never consistently the same. Have we anything else to say to show, my dear Cebes, that this is not the case? We have not. Well then, that being so, is it not natural for the body to dissolve easily and for the soul to be altogether indissoluble, or nearly so. So we have here a further categorization of the body and of the soul. We have the understanding that there is a piece to man's existence that transcends his conscious existence in bodily form. It transcends his individual nature. For his thoughts and the expression of his soul extend out into a realm of our reality that is beyond decay, that is beyond the natural way of things as we experience, tethered to this body. What we illuminate in that aspect of our reality is the depth of mind. Now, mind isn't all that we consider the soul to be, but certainly mind and the physical structure that makes it up, that makes it possible within this reality, is a major piece of our soul. You realize, he said, that when a man dies, the visible part, the body which exists in the visible world, and which we call the corpse, whose natural lot it would be to dissolve, fall apart, and be blown away, does not immediately suffer any of these things, but remains for a fair time, in fact quite a long time if a man dies with his body in a suitable condition, and at a favorable season. If the body is emaciated or embalmed, as it is in Egypt, it remains almost whole for a remarkable length of time. And even if the body decays, some parts of it, namely bones and sinews, and the like, are nevertheless, one might say, deathless. Is that not so? Yes. Will the soul, the invisible part, which makes its way to a region of the same kind, noble and pure and invisible, to Hades, in fact, to the good and wise God, whither, God willing, my soul must be soon going? Will the soul, being of this kind in nature, be scattered and destroyed on leaving the body, as the majority of men say? Far from it, my dear Cebes and Simmias, but what happens is much more like this. If it is pure when it leaves the body, and drags nothing bodily with it, as it had no willing association with the body in life, but avoided it and gathered itself together by itself, and always practiced this, which is no other than practicing philosophy in the right way, in fact training to die easily. Or is this not training for death? It surely is. A soul in this state makes its way to the invisible, which is like itself, the divine and immortal and wise, and arriving there it can be happy, having rid itself of confusion, ignorance, fear, violent desires, and the other human ills, and, as I said, or as is said of the initiates, truly spend the rest of time with the gods. Shall we say this, Cebes, or something different? This, by Zeus, said Cebes. Now it's an interesting conception. It's an interesting idea of what happens to the soul after the body dies. But how can we make this claim? How can we be certain? that when a man has lived his life in such a way as to separate the soul from the body through practice and through discipline, how is this proof that the soul continues? And we have yet to understand exactly what the soul is. We understand to some degree of certain pieces of it, that it is most like the divine. It's deathless, intelligible, uniform, and dissoluble, always the same as itself. But I've said before that the soul is not the whole of mind, because the pieces of mind that are temporary must necessarily die with it. And those of mind that I believe are temporary, surely I've mentioned some of them thus far, but they have to do with those aspects of mind that are necessarily tethered to the body to exist in this natural reality, part of which has to do with self-preservation and the sense of things that mentioned by Socrates here, by fear, violent desires, ignorance, confusion. Sort of a disordered state of mind that comes from a lack of understanding of the inputs that are received by the body. But the remainder, what of this remainder? Again, how can we be so certain that it goes to Hades to spend the rest of its days in peace with the gods? But I think that if the soul is polluted and impure when it leaves the body, having always been associated with it and served it, bewitched by physical desires and pleasures, to the point at which nothing seems to exist for it but the physical, which one can touch and see or eat and drink or make use of for sexual enjoyment. And if that soul is accustomed to hate and fear and avoid that which is dim and invisible to the eyes but intelligible and to be grasped by philosophy, do you think such a soul will escape pure and by itself? Impossible, he said. It is no doubt permeated by the physical, which constant intercourse and association with the body, as well as considerable practice, has caused to become ingrained in it. Quite so. We must believe, my friend, that this bodily element is heavy, ponderous, earthly, and visible. Through it, such a soul has become heavy and is dragged back to the visible region in fear for the unseen and of Hades. It wanders, as we are told, around graves and monuments, where shadowy phantoms, images that such souls produce, have been seen. Souls that have not been freed and purified, but share in the visible, and are therefore seen. That is likely, Socrates. It is indeed, Zebes, moreover. These are not the souls of good, but of inferior men, which are forced to wander there, paying the penalty for their previous bad upbringing. They wander until their longing for that which accompanies them, the physical, again imprisons them in a body, and they are then, as is likely, bound to such characters as they have practiced in their life. I wonder of this soul. if its condition is independent to the action of man during his life. For if man as he exists is a mirror to the divine, this is my conception, then what he reflects is in some sense what he chooses to see. And his soul is a fundamental constant. It is independent of the individual. Now you can have a soul that is bound more closely to the bodily, and these souls will have a constant resonance to them. Perhaps the degree to which it is perhaps I should say the closeness between the body and the soul can be of varying degrees. And the specific point that we fall upon our death on that scale is the sort of affinity of the soul. It is according to the life that we had lived. And this soul, as it exists, or as it existed, then becomes fixed in this point, again between the separation of this soul and body, some closer than others. The ones that are closer are bound more strongly to bodily desires, whereas the farther are bound less tightly, much more loosely, more spiritual, more infinite. And as man's existence continues, as new infants are brought into this world, the soul that inhabits them, no doubt influenced by their environment, their parents and all of this, they again choose what to reflect, what of the divine they wish to see. And through their life, they build this soul of theirs. They find themselves at a particular point on the scale between the separation of the soul and the body. And again, the pattern, I think, continues, for there have been many that have existed in the past. And the patterns of these souls continue. The patterns of those who are bound to their sexual desires. The pattern of those that are concerned not much for the matters of this world, but for the more abstract principles. Of those who are concerned for justice, for the beautiful, for the good. But there still, in my mind, is a bit of a hang-up. What does it mean for the soul to go to Hades and to continue to exist in a particular way that is so similar to that of the experience of man as he exists on this earth? Is Hades not another place for which the soul can be bound to another earthly type of reality? The image in my mind seems to be too similar to our experience that we experience here. And that of this resultant idea, not explicitly stated here by Socrates, but it's a potential that the souls are constant in nature, and that upon death, the souls that do wander the graves, it seems as though he suggests that at a certain point they will find a body, and this existence will be repeated in the same manner. Now, in some sense, this is true. In some sense, the affliction, the mistakes, the patterns of life of another will repeat in the body of another. And we can say that the thing that unites them, like we were talking about before in our discussions of unity of these higher principles, like the capital E equal, we could see a unification in terms of soul. And perhaps this is what he's referring to. That is to say, perhaps I am the one that is thinking too individualistically. And that if we remove that individual, that there are elements of the soul, elements of this soul that perhaps can include many different individuals within it. Where the boundaries are, I don't know. But this is just a thought, and I would hope that this would be something that is explored further in this dialogue. Another thing that cannot be easily overlooked is the reports of these phantoms. Now, certainly we have the reports of the ghosts and phantoms in modern times. There are many people that believe in this sort of phenomenon. And you do have to wonder. I myself have never experienced it. I tend to hesitate to say that this is an actual thing that is possible. But perhaps it is possible. Even if it is not in the sense of the literal, I do think that there is some grounds by which we can follow the reasoning, much of which I've already laid out, again about this proximity to mind and body and the repeatability of life and experience and the newly birthed into this existence and to those that have lived in the past. It is indeed, Sebes, moreover, these are not the souls of good but of inferior men, which are forced to wander there, paying the penalty for their previous bad upbringing. They wander until their longing for that which accompanies them, the physical, again imprisons them in a body, and they are then, as is luckily bound, to such characters as they have practiced in their life. Now you have to wonder, the pattern of family trauma, family upbringing, if there is a poor family structure, the child that is raised in that environment is much more likely to be placed within that environment later in life, raise children in that environment, and repeat that cycle. Now, what exactly that means at the level of the soul, I'm not too sure. Perhaps the souls of previous eras, perhaps the souls of nature, this sort of consistent soul, again the unification principle, unified at a particular proximity to the body. These types of souls re-inhabit the human world and continue their pattern. In this example, I think a lot about spirit, but spirit and soul are not the same thing. They're not equivalent. Spirit is more the things that we can pick up on, but we cannot experience directly or perceive directly. It is the smelling of a campfire or the burning of leaves when we cannot see the fire itself, but we can smell the burning. What kind of characters do you say that these are, Socrates? Those, for example, who have carelessly practiced gluttony, violence, and drunkenness, and are likely to join a company of donkeys, or of similar animals. Do you not think so? Very likely. Those who have esteemed injustice highly, and tyranny and plunder, will join the tribes of wolves and hawks and kites. Where else shall we say that they go? Certainly to those, said Cebes, and certainly the destination of the others will conform to the way in which they have behaved? Certainly, of course. The happiest of these, who will also have the best destination, are those who have practiced popular and social virtue, which they call moderation and justice, and which was developed by habit and practice, without philosophy or understanding. How are they the happiest? Because it is likely that they will again join a social and gentle group, either of bees or wasps or ants, and then again the same kind of human group, and so be moderate men. So here we have the pattern that I mentioned. The likelihood of men existing in a particular way, given the opportunity for the future, for their posterity to continue to live in the way that they live. Now that view I recognize is much centered in the natural reality, in the physical world, in the individual world. It's difficult for me to flip it. I think I am a person, a product of the secular age. But if I were to attempt to flip it, and to see it in terms of the purely spiritual, and that of the soul, I suppose I could say that these souls, these constants of the divine nature, flow down and inhabit man because they are inhabitable by their physical makeup, by the architecture in their brains, their neural architecture. They are susceptible to be inhabited by the spiritual realm. And so these spirits, these souls, they find them. But what I can't quite determine at this point is the absolute nature of this. That is, a soul of a particular kind that inhabits the body of a man. There still is this idea that as the soul inhabits this body of man, that this man can change his life. He can change his destiny. He has free will. And when I think of the conception of the soul that comes from the divine source, something that was at once infinite, an infinite being, has become sort of a lesser being in order to habit the lesser being in the physical sense of the human being. Even at the highest possible point at which this is possible for man, there is still limitations. The soul can only separate itself so much from the body. So in summation here, I can say that I have two problems that remain with this. The determinacy of the soul as it inhabits the body, and the fallen nature of man and the implications that that has for the future of man. Now, this is a very Christian question, I understand that, but we are in the Greek world now, and we are going to follow their reason. No one may join the company of the gods who has not practiced philosophy, and is not completely pure when he departs from life. No one but the lover of learning. It is for this reason, my friends Simmias and Cebes, that those who practice philosophy in the right way keep away from all bodily passions, master them, and do not surrender themselves to them. It is not at all for fear of wasting their substance and of poverty, which is the majority, and the money lovers fear, nor for fear of dishonor and ill repute, like the ambitious and lovers of honors, that they keep away from them. I've always, when I read this, it registered with me. I've always felt a certain way about health, about the philosophy to health, about dieting and about exercise. Because although it is a good thing to diet and to exercise for one's health, it is good in a certain way, but it is not good in another way if, for the reason that you do it, is to maintain the health of the body for the sole reason of maximizing one's longevity, for the sole purpose of making more money, being more effective at one's job, so that they can have more material gains in this life. Now, there are a bunch of caveats in there, because it is a moral duty of one to be good at one's job, at one's duty. But it is for the sake of learning and of wisdom that one does so, not for the sake of the money or the rewards that one gets from that type of behavior. Just as in exercise, it is not for the shape of the body that one should exercise, but for the experience of mind that one must put themselves through, and the learning that they receive, that is the important thing. This is why I have sort of an adverse opinion to that of the bodybuilding culture. It is not to say that resistance training is negative, because there is things to be learned through resistance training. There are hurdles that can be surpassed. There are goals that can be achieved. But again, the purely physical and the narcissism of appearance is not the right way to approach that discipline. And so it seems as though that in life, if man commits himself to knowledge, this commitment to knowledge and to learning, this process of becoming that something of closer and closer to a being that can just sort of exist in his understanding. It can perform a task proficiently, is one that understands what it means to be closer to the gods, for they exist in this sort of state of being. There is this idea in my mind about soul. The soul is this constant. In some sense I want to say a constant of nature, but I don't think that would be quite right. It's the constant of the divine nature. The soul is a pattern. It's an interesting pattern. It's interesting, I think, in the case of man, because as we have alluded to many times, and we have explicitly stated, I'm sure, many times, this soul is not pure in the body of man. Now, this is Plato's argument that the body is this inherently corruptible entity, and that it pollutes the soul. And thus far, we've sort of been trying to decipher what the soul is. Now, we've been trying to decipher it, of course, within the mind and within the body of a man. And it's a difficult thing to do, to detach the soul from the body, as Plato and Socrates have stated. But when I read the happiest of these, referring to the souls, who will also have the best destination, are those who have practiced popular and social virtue, which they call moderation and justice, and which was developed by habit and practice, without philosophy or understanding. The question is, how are they the happiest? Because it is likely that they will again join a social and gentle group, either of bees or wasps or ants, and that again the same kind of human group, and so be moderate men. And so from this conception, we see the soul of man lifted up out of body, and then suddenly return to it, return to a new group of men. And this group of men, or I should say the soul enters the group based on prior action in some sense. This is a complicated problem. It seems simple at its surface, but I think it's certainly confused, certainly from the modern mind, because my conceptions are so fraught with materialism that it's difficult to understand what the meaning of destination is for something that is without fundamental elements of who I consider myself to be. Now, it lacks this ego. It lacks the deception of the body, the deceptions of the heart. And I think that we've already spoken quite recently of the individuals that have the heavy bodily elements. The paragraph, "We must believe, my friend, that this bodily element is heavy, ponderous, earthly, and visible. Through it, such a soul has become heavy and is dragged back to the visible region in fear of the unseen and of Hades. It wanders, as we are told, around graves and monuments, where shadowy phantoms, images that such souls produce, have been seen. Souls that have not been freed and purified, but share in the visible, and are therefore seen." My confusion, I think, lies within the translation between the earthly and the heavenly. Within this process of becoming, my understanding dissolves. I think it might have to do with the inability to answer the question why. In some sense, it's a question of how, but I suppose how doesn't interest me all that much. Well, maybe it does. The how and the why. Now, the divine thing in and of itself is much more difficult for me to imagine, certainly, than the earthly. Because the earthly is the one that I experience, is the one that we all experience. But let's say I was to die after I recorded this. What then? Many would say that my soul would have some action. What can I say of my soul? What can I say of my soul in this context that we see here of Plato? Has it too many earthly elements? Will it remain fixed to the earth, in some sense? Will it be, and will it inhabit, the body of a moderate man? What is the body of a moderate man without his soul, if his soul is not to be that of the just and of the good, and perhaps of the moderate? It seems that we have two issues here, but they all have to do with becoming, because on one hand it is the theory of opposites that moves from life to death, and the becoming between them, the continuation of soul, continuation of the pattern of soul, and then within the individual, what does it mean for man to move closer to being, to this cycle, to move closer to soul? But what is he, and what is it moving towards? Is it not the sacrifice of the he for the it, for the is? This question came up many times in the Psalms, and as I think about it now, I have this strange feeling that I know the answer. Not necessarily in the Platonic sense that this knowledge is known to me. Perhaps it is. Known to me in the sense before I was born. Known to me as I grew into myself, into adulthood. But known in the sense that it was revealed to me explicitly in the Psalms. About this relationship to the I, to the soul. And what is the I? Of course, the Psalms were very good at compartmentalizing, about moving the heart into its proper place, about moving the soul into its proper place, about moving the mind into its proper place. But the I is a tricky thing, because the I communicates with the heart, and it communicates with the soul. It is as though it is intertwined with both. We can fundamentally distinguish between the two, but at some point there's a convergence. And when we get lost, when I get lost in the convergence, I tend to forget. I tend to forget that there's a separation of these things at all. And it's a head-spinning experience to fall into it. You know, an analogy that comes to mind is the rotator cuff in the shoulder. Now, the rotator cuff is a series of muscles that has its origin and its attachments on the scapula, on the humerus. But also the tendinous fibers intertwine with the joint capsule of the shoulder. This strong fibrous material. And I find myself sort of at the point of crossover between this tendinous material and the joint capsule. Because at a certain point you just cannot tell anymore. At a certain point you can't tell when the I and the soul intersect. At a certain point you can't understand when the soul and the heart intersect. But I think from what I understand now, it is that the desires of the heart must be in line to our conception of what the divine being is, our highest conception of what the good and the beautiful and the just are. So that our feelings and desires are stimulated by our understanding of what is right. And the I chooses through its own will and makes appropriate sacrifices. And these sacrifices, I think, are small forms of suicide. Now, it's strange to say that, but I think that this is the case. Plato says that the soul must be separated from the body, or at least the philosopher's duty is to sort of prepare for his death. Now, how do you prepare for your death if you don't sacrifice parts of the self? This sort of act of incomplete suicide, so that one is ready for death. They're not worried about it. They've dealt with the existential questions. They've separated much of the bodily desire. The bodily desire that attaches itself to the earthly longing. And its desires are, I think, fundamentally shifted in line with the soul. The soul that desires to be with God. Now this is part of the dilemma that we're facing here. It's, Socrates is about to die. He's about to drink the poison. His friends are trying to convince him to leave. They say that what he's doing is not right, that it's committing suicide, and in a way it is. But also in another way it is not. Because there is context. He has duty to the state. For the state has brought him into being. It's a strange, complicated relationship it is to be a human being. No one may join the company of the gods who has not practiced philosophy, and it is not completely pure when he departs from life. No one but the lover of learning. It is for this reason, my friends Simmias and Cebes, that those who practice philosophy in the right way keep away from all bodily passions, master them and do not surrender themselves to them. It is not at all for fear of wasting their substance and of poverty, which the majority and the money lovers fear, nor for fear of dishonor and ill repute, like the ambitious and lovers of honors, that they keep away from them. I think Plato's idealism can be a bit suffocating at times. I'm not sure how many of us are completely pure in life. No one but those who practice philosophy in the right way keep away from all bodily passions, master them, and do not surrender themselves to them. Don't we all have some bodily passion? Aren't we all guilty? Aren't we all sinners? That would not be natural for them, Socrates, said Cebes. By Zeus, no, he said, those who care for their own soul and do not live for the service of their body dismisses all these things. They do not travel the same road as those who do not know where they are going, but, believing that nothing should be done contrary to philosophy and their deliverance and purification, they turn to this and follow wherever philosophy leads. I suppose in some sense my struggle is that between the care for the material world and that for the care of the soul. It is just this problem that is described. It is the surrendering of the body, the sacrifice of the body. not to live for the service of the body, to dismiss all of these things. You know, the statement, they do not travel the same road as those who do not know where they are going, but believing that nothing should be done contrary to philosophy and their deliverance and purification. They turn to this and follow wherever philosophy leads. Now, aspiring to such a state of being, I think, it's interesting. I don't understand. I find it difficult to understand how it's possible to do this completely. I think of my life, and I think of all of the things that I wish I could change, and I wonder how much of this is me getting in my own way, and I wonder how much of this is me recognizing the truth of the problem and saying, this is indeed something that I need to change so that I can live for philosophy, I guess, in this sense, so that I can surrender the body, and that what I'm doing now is for the body and not for the soul. That level of honesty, I think, is kind of difficult, especially in the modern day, when it seems as though we have built our society around material things about this life. It's almost as if we've imprisoned our souls to this earth. It's a very strange time to be alive, I suppose. I will tell you, he said, the lovers of learning know that when philosophy gets a hold of their soul, it is imprisoned in and clinging to the body, and that it is forced to examine other things through it as through a cage, and not by itself, and that it wallows in every kind of ignorance. Philosophy sees that the worst feature of this imprisonment is that it is due to desires, so that the prisoner himself is contributing to his own incarceration most of all. As I say, the lovers of learning know that philosophy gets hold of their souls when it is in that state, then gently encourages it and tries to free it by showing them that investigation through the eyes is full of deceit, as that through the ears and the other senses. Philosophy then persuades the soul to withdraw from the senses, insofar as it is not compelled to use them, and bids the soul to gather itself together by itself, to trust only itself, and whatever reality existing by itself, the soul by itself understands, and not to consider as true whatever it examines by other means, for this is different in different circumstances, and is sensible and visible, whereas what the soul itself sees is intelligible and invisible. The soul of the true philosopher thinks that this deliverance must not be opposed, and so keeps away from pleasures and desires and pains as far as he can. He reflects that violent pleasures or pain or passion does not cause merely such evils as one might expect, such as one suffers when one has been sick or extravagant through desire, but the greatest and most extreme evil, though one does not reflect on this. So this is exactly what we're talking about. The lovers of learning know that when philosophy gets a hold of their soul, it is imprisoned in and clinging to the body, and that it is forced to examine other things through it as though a cage, and not by itself, and that it wallows in every kind of ignorance. So I think there's a few things that we need to tease out here. So the lovers of learning, the people that are interested, the people that have some meaningful purpose, some reason to attend to the practice of philosophy. Once this gets a hold of their soul, it is imprisoned in and clinging to the body, and that it is forced to examine other things. So what is it? Is it the lovers of learning? Is it the practice of philosophy, or is it the soul? Certainly we would say it's the soul. The soul is imprisoned in and clinging to the body, and that it is forced to examine other things through it, as through a cage, and not by itself, and that it wallows in every kind of ignorance. Philosophy sees that the worst feature of this imprisonment is that it is due to desires, so that the prisoner himself is contributing to his own incarceration most of all. Now that's a profound statement. Philosophy sees that the worst feature of this imprisonment is that it is due to desires, so that the prisoner himself is contributing to his own incarceration most of all. What comes to mind is the inability to recognize when one's desires contribute to his own imprisonment. Of course, we are mentioning here that through philosophy, that one is more apt, one is more likely to be able to see when these desires, or how these desires, imprison one. And it is not a simple matter, especially for those who feel that their desires and their feelings are wrapped up intimately in their sense of being, and their belonging and their purpose. Now this becomes a problem when this sense of purpose and this belonging is not in agreement. It's not in agreement with the higher virtues. And this friction, the stress and the anxiety comes from the desire for an end, some end that is inferior to a satisfactory state of being. Now Socrates says that when philosophy gets a hold of the soul, it gently encourages it and tries to free it by showing them that investigation through the eyes is full of deceit, as is that through the ears and other senses. I'm not sure how gentle the experience is. For somebody like myself, the experience, I think, is a bit rough. But perhaps it has to do with the state of one's imprisonment, the extent of one's desires. And if philosophy is to persuade the soul not to use the desires, or as Plato puts it, to withdraw from the senses insofar as it is not compelled to use them, and bids the soul to gather itself together by itself, to trust only itself, and whatever reality existing by itself, the soul by itself understands. There's a lot of itself there. And I think this gets back to my former complaint about how exactly and where exactly is the line drawn between the the senses, the desires, and the feelings from the I, the individual, and what we consider to be the soul. And in the absence of our desires, what does that mean for the individual? What does that individual look like? A complete liberation from the things that are inferior, that hold us back every day. The feelings of exhaustion, the desire for extended rest, the thoughts and anxieties that come from novel experiences that perhaps plague us. We find ourselves in these situations because we don't enjoy the choices that we've made in life, and we have ended up in a particular situation that we wish we could change. These are desires, these are feelings. How wonderful would it be to completely sever that link and let the soul be as it is? But again, the question is, without the feelings and the desires, what is the impetus for change? How does the soul behave by itself? What does it mean to exist by itself? To trust itself only. Socrates says here, the soul by itself understands, and it does not consider as true whatever it examines by other means, for this is different in different circumstances, and is sensible and visible, whereas what the soul itself sees is intelligible and invisible. So something that is beyond the sight, something that is beyond our senses. But what is the sight in this scenario? Is it purely the organ that picks up the information from the environment? Or is this a bit of an extended analogy? The sight that can see into the future, that can project one's wishes, perhaps one's desires. I suppose it would have to be that type of vision as well, if we are talking about the liberation of the souls from the desires. If seeing is not just the sense organ that takes in visual information for the mind to perceive, but also the mind as it sees through its desires to some achievable aim. I think both of these types of seeing are perhaps false in a way. And it's interesting that the soul is not to consider as true whatever it examines by other means. And it's because that it is different in different circumstances. And that it is bound to this material reality. The soul, the thing that we sort of have faith in, when properly directed, seems to be beyond our comprehension. Its designs beyond our comprehension. But in the absence of inputs and feedback, how do we know that we walk the right path? The soul of the true philosopher thinks that this deliverance must not be opposed, and so keeps away from pleasures and desires, and pains as far as he can. He reflects that violent pleasure, or pain, or passion does not cause merely such evils as one might expect, such as one suffers when one has been sick, or extravagant through desire, but the greatest and most extreme evil. The one does not reflect on this. So this soul of man, liberated from its desires, is this thing that is left open to do as it pleases. But in my mind so far, I think of the soul as this thing that is almost beyond mind. And how can it be that we have something, this known force, within us, perhaps within our minds, within the essence of our existence, that can truly guide us towards the right path? Surely it must come from a divine source outside of us, an organ within the mind of man that picks up on this, and thereby acts in the right way, so as not to be burdened by circumstance, not to be burdened by subjectivism. And so we keep away from the pleasures and desires because these are the things that would oppose the soul. And so if this extreme pleasure produces the greatest and most extreme evil, what is it? Socrates says that the soul of every man, when it feels violent pleasure or pain in connection with some object, inevitably believes at the same time that what causes such feelings must be very clear and very true, which it is not. Such objects are mostly visible, are they not? And Sieb says certainly. And doesn't such an experience tie the soul to the body most completely? How so? Because every pleasure or pain provides, as it were, another nail to rivet the soul to the body, and to weld them together, to make the soul corporeal, so that it believes that truth is what the body says it is. As it shares the beliefs and delights of the body, I think it inevitably becomes to share its ways and manner of life, and is unable to ever reach Hades in a pure state. It is always full of body when it departs, so that it soon falls back into another body and grows with it, as if it has been sown into it. Because of this, it can have no part in the company of the divine, the pure and uniform. And so we have this continuation of the idea of that of the physical, of the material, of the corporeal, fixing the soul to the earth. And the more it does so, the more the soul is unable to free itself to become part of the divine entity and reside within the divine space. He continues by saying, this is how the soul of a philosopher would reason. It would not think that while philosophy must free it, it should, while being freed, surrender itself to pleasures and pains and imprison itself again, thus laboring in vain like Penelope at her web. The soul of the philosopher achieves a calm from such emotions. If follows reason, and ever stays with it contemplating the true, the divine, which is not the object of opinion. Nurtured by this, it believes that one should live in this manner as long as one is alive, and after death arrives at what is akin and of the same kind, and escape from human evils. After such nurture, there is no danger. Simmias and Sebes, that one should fear that on parting from the body, the soul would be scattered and dissipated by the winds, and no longer be anything anywhere. Now the question again in my mind is, well, how far does this go? Now we mentioned before about the two different types of seeing, the sight that is truly visual, that is the sight that picks up information from the environment so that we can perceive, and then the type of sight that's a little bit more elevated, the next level up, let's say. It uses information about its environment, let's say, about the place that it finds itself in, and the state of mind that it finds itself in, and then from that state observes the feelings that flow from it. And I think this is also a mistake. I think this is also following the body, even though it is more of an elevated pursuit, an elevated thought. It's really not following reason. At one sense, it may feel like it's following reason, but that's just the thing. It's the feeling that is not the reason. But then what is reason? And much of our reason these days is bound up in the corporeal, in what we consider to be the objective reality, the material reality. And it is nothing but our observations, albeit our observations of this reality are formed by reasonable measure. But this reasonable measure relies on the senses to take in the information, to use the tools that we have available to us to perceive of the external environment. But there's nothing of this sort, there's nothing of reason in this sense that guides us towards the spiritual and the divine. So this hole that I think is created is a bit of a predicament in my mind. This is something that I've thought about many times, and every time I think about it, I find myself strangely confused. I may come into a satisfactory answer at one point and then return to it completely bewildered. I think this calm from emotions is a crucial component to this puzzle. Because the calm, I think, implies a satisfaction with the way of being, with the state of being. And I think that this is the end of the philosopher. Again, to liberate himself from that which plagues him and tethers him to the material, to the corporeal. It follows reason and ever stays with it contemplating the true, the divine, which is not the object of opinion. Now this is a difficult one, again for the reasons that we have laid out. Nurture, by this, it believes that one should live in this manner as long as one is alive, and after death arrive at what is akin and of the same kind, and escape from human evils. So this is now very fanciful imagery and dialogue. But there are major things, I think, that we need to understand before moving forward. And I think it rests within the following of reason. and contemplating the true and the divine. And so this discussion is followed by a period of silence in which Socrates is reflecting on what he had just said, and his friends Cebes and Simmias are there discussing among one another. Socrates notices this, and he asks them, "Is there something lacking in my argument? There are still many doubtful points and many objections for anyone who wants a thorough discussion of these matters. If you are discussing some other subject, I have nothing to say. But if you have some difficulty about this one, do not hesitate to speak for yourselves and expound it if you think the argument can be improved. And if you think you will do better, take me along with you in the discussion." "I will tell you the truth, Socrates," said Simmias. "Both of us have been in difficulty for some time, and each of us has been urging the other to question you, because we wanted to hear what you would say. But we hesitated to bother you, lest it be displeasing to you in your present misfortune." Now I'm glad that there is a rebuttal here, because I myself have been finding difficulty with the argument that Socrates is putting forth. Now Simmias says, "I will tell you my difficulty," and then Cebes will say why he does not accept what was said. "I believe, as perhaps you do, that precise knowledge on the subject is impossible or extremely difficult in our present life, but that it surely shows a very poor spirit not to examine thoroughly what is said about it, and to desist before one is exhausted by an all-around investigation. One should achieve one of these things, learn the truth about these things, or find it for oneself. Or, if that is impossible, adopt the best and most irrefutable of men's theories, and borne upon this, sail through the dangers of life as upon a raft, unless someone should make that journey safer and less risky upon a firmer vessel of some divine doctrine. So even now, since you have said what you did, I feel no shame at asking questions, and I will not blame myself in the future because I did not say what I think. As I examine what we said, both by myself and with Cebes, it does not seem to be adequate." And Socrates says, "You may well be right, my friend, but tell me how it is inadequate." So Simmias, in my opinion, makes a rather disappointing rebuttal to Socrates. He restates Socrates' argument. He proposes an example about music and the musical instrument, where the melody that is produced is that's sort of akin to the soul. It is the thing that is non-corporeal. It is infinite. It is intelligible. It is invisible. And then there is the instrument, the lyre, the stringed instrument with all of its pieces and the wood. And upon breaking the instrument, we have the end of the material structure. But what still continues to exist is the melody itself, and perhaps by extension all possible melodies. Now this is not the part of Simmias's rebuttal, but also what would be a part of this would be the idea of the lyre itself after it is destroyed. And Simmias goes on to make the argument that since the body is the balance of different elements and different forces of nature, that I should say also that these forces of nature are, as he says, in due measure. That is, they are together in such a way that can sustain the operation that is the human being, and that if it's stretched to the extremes beyond measure, then the body ceases to exist. And he says, well, it perishes either by disease or what have you, or other evils, he says. And he says if this is the case, and if this is to happen, then the soul also must be immediately destroyed, even if it be most divine. He says, as are the other harmonies found in music and all other works of artists, and the remains of each body last for a long time until they rot or are burned. And so Simmias takes the strictly material argument. He even goes on to say that the music does not exist out there in the ether. The music is as it is manifested in the material world. If it is not recorded for somebody else to see and interpret, then it essentially doesn't exist. Now, it is a fine argument, but this is not the argument that we had proposed. This is not the issue that we had with Socrates. So in this way, it's disappointing. It's interesting in and of itself. So Socrates then appeals to Cebes and asks him what exactly his argument is, or his rebuttal to Socrates' argument, before he moves forward to answer Simmias. But this we will cover on the next episode. So we will continue next time with Phaedo, with the discussion by Cebes.